In the imagination of the world, the easternmost lands of Europa are still wild and mysterious. It is seen as an endless frontier of vast plains and primeval forests that stretches to the faraway waters of the Pacific, and all cast in an endless tide of ice. Tales are told of the daring horsemen who race across the boundless steppe, of bitter winters without end, and rugged hunters who march through rifts of snow braving fierce tigers and other exotic predators. The truth is not quite so dramatic, for the march of progress has brought civilization to even the most remote corners of the world. Any traveler is far more likely to instead find charming cafes overlooking paved avenues, and all the other pleasantries of modern cities that are equal to any other on the continent. Yet, while the East has been tamed, none who know the country would say it was done without cost. If there is one constant to these lands, it is that they abide only the rule of the strong. They have known princes and kings, tyrants and Caesars, Khans and conquerors. Today, they know the strength of the Tsar, and the great frontiers of the East are united under the rule of the Rusviet Tsardom. Yet, how much longer the strength of the Tsar can bind the country together is the preeminent question across the nation. For much of its history, the Tsar's authority was without limit, surpassing even that of the Kaiser of Saxony. Atrocious losses during the Great War, territorial concessions, and the prospect of a bloody revolution have incited talks of political reform. The Rusviet Tsardom is already on the path of transitioning from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional system, but these political changes have been interpreted as a weakness to some, a betrayal to others, and only galvanized factions within the government and across the country. The current Tsar, Nikolaj, remains the head of state, but many executive powers have been transferred to the Council of Ministers. While committees of this type have existed across the nation's history, their powers were typically trivial or ceremonial in nature. Now, for the first time, real political authority has been wrested away from the Tsar, and it is the chairman of the Council of Ministers who serves as the head of government. A legislative assembly known as the Duma, once an unthinkable institution, has likewise been entrusted with greater power and responsibilities. Split between various political parties and often boycotted by more radical groups, the Duma has nevertheless been able to introduce further reforms. Increasingly, the moderate elements of the Duma have been pushed aside in favor of more fanatical parties on either side. The assembly is each day more divided between those who demand further reforms and those who believe the reforms have already gone too far. Both the Council of Ministers and the factions within the Duma must still contend with the authority of the Tsar, however. Comparatively more progressive and open than his predecessors, Nikolaj has nevertheless been determined to retain many of his autocratic powers. During the Great War, fear of Saxon domination was barely enough to hold the fractured Rusviet state together. The patriotism and enthusiasm with which the nation entered the war could not endure the initial terrible defeats, and when a bloody revolution nearly erupted on the streets of the capital, St. Petersburg, it seemed poised to tear the state apart. Had the Rusviet army not counterattacked with such vigor against Saxony, and emergency concessions not made to the revolutionaries, the legacy of Nikolaj might have been that of a bloody stain upon a wall. While this catastrophe has been averted, the struggle between the Tsar, his advisors, and newly resurgent outside factions now completely define Rusviet politics. But even the Tsar's traditional allies, the aristocracy, the church, and the military, have grown uneasy with his more liberal policies. The mysterious Rasputin, said to be the closest advisor to both the Tsar and his wife, has likewise alienated many of Nikolaj's supporters, and suspected to be inciting much of the social unrest across the country. It was his influence that is rumored to have ended the immediate threat of revolution, and this so-called man of the people has taken on the role of chief negotiator between the Tsar the revolutionaries, and his people. There is perhaps no more stark evidence of the Tsar's weakened position within the country than in the emblem of the nation itself. The traditional imperial coat of arms has been replaced by a single red star, the emblem of one of Rusviet's most radical groups and staunch opponents of the Tsar himself. While a humiliation of the country's ancient ruling dynasty, practically, it remains a largely trivial concession, but perhaps indicative of the country's future. Such sweeping reforms have not been limited to the nation's political structure. The lives of the Rusviet lower classes had been relatively stagnant for centuries, but with industrialization, the Great War, and the uneasy peace that has since followed, there has come an opportunity for social mobility. The Great War in particular proved that mechanization and an educated, literate labor pool is essential for the survival of the state. Merchants, industrialists, and bankers are increasingly found in the upper echelons of a new kind of aristocracy, displacing the centuries-old nobility in the process. But the most drastic change within the Rusviet Tsardom has been seen in its military apparatus. The Rusviet military, traditionally one of the great forces on the continent, was slow to adapt to changing circumstances and adopt new technologies. Instead, the Rusviet doctrine was focused on the country's immense manpower reserves and vast territorial expanse. The terrible losses of the Great War proved that these advantages had lost much of their value. In the most dire years of the conflict, Rusviet artillery batteries were limited to firing a few shells per day, as Saxony unleashed thousands. Losses escalated to such an extent that even the Rusviet army experienced manpower shortages. Since the outbreak of the hostilities, the military has been forced to accept the new nature of war and has been introducing new technologies and tactics. The concept of massed infantry assaults has yet to be universally abandoned, but the idea of massed firepower and combined arms warfare has become popular in certain circles of the Rusviet General Staff. Rusviet Vanguard units, the elite and most loyal core of the Rusviet army, have been nearly universally equipped with trench guns. These weapons proved to be extraordinarily efficient in the close quarters and urban battlefields of the Great War, so much so that they drew a diplomatic protest from the Saxon government. Machine guns, flamethrowers, and handheld anti-mech weaponry, once a rarity across the Rusviet army, are likewise being allocated at much higher numbers. It is the auto-machines, walking machines, or simply mechs, that most acutely reflect the new Rusviet approach to warfare. The first designs, based on the works of Nikola Tesla, were a deciding factor in the Great War, and every nation has struggled to keep pace with one another. Generally, Rusviet mechs are slower, but more heavily armored than their Saxon, Polanian, or Nordic counterparts. This has led to the misconception that Rusviet equipment is outdated, but this choice reflects a uniquely Rusviet method of design. Rather than produce costly, complicated mechs intended never to break down, Rusviet mechs can be cheaply produced in vast numbers, with each straightforward to repair and maintain. Iterative designs are similarly preferred, rather than introducing completely new models that might disrupt established production lines. Many mechs have already entered regular service within the Rusviet army, including specialized anti-armor, anti-personnel, and artillery variants. The largest of these, the SHM-70 Gulye-Gorod, is by contrast a multi-purpose mech, equally suited to engaging infantry and other, smaller mechs. It is the SHM-69 SERP, though, that most accurately reflects the blunt, Rusviet approach design style, equipped with two immense blades capable of slicing rival mechs into ribbons. Yet the Rusviet army is not devoid of more nuanced and innovative designs. The SMH-60 Groza exosuit has unparalleled mobility for any mech of its size, allowing its wearer to engage in a controlled, short-range rocket jump. The sight of these new machines has caused concern over a new European arms race, but it may already be too late. Since its early history, the Rusviet nation has only endured through the mobilization of armies and the fires of war. In ages past, they had to contend with the golden Khanates of Asia, the Nordic kings of Scandinavia, and the unification of the Saxon tribes. Today, these powers have new names, but the threat they pose to the Rusviet people remains. Even before the Great War, the Tsardom endured a time of troubles. The January uprising of 1863 led to the creation of a fiercely independent Polania and a new rival in Central Europa. War between the Tsardom and the Togawa shogunate exposed the true value of walking machines on the battlefield and the corruption and incompetence rampant throughout the Rusviet army. It was likely this latter humiliation that emboldened the Empire of Saxony in the Great War, and the disastrous performance of the Rusviet army did little to dissuade them. Only blood, steel, faith, and years of slaughter prevented the complete collapse of the Tsardom and returned to it some measure of honor and prestige. But it may not be enough to keep the vast nation intact. The Rusviet Tsardom stretches from the occupied territories of eastern Polania to the Alaskan wilderness of North America, but the only constant is the whispered talk of the Tsar's weakness, of promised reforms or radical action. In Europa, Saxony has never truly been defeated, and its reinvigorated war machine threatens to unleash the horrors of the Great War on an even larger and more terrible scale. Polania boils at the thought of their lands taken by Rusviet soldiers, while Crimean Cossacks test the resolve of Rusviet border garrisons. As the world grows ever smaller, distant Albion and Togawa might too prosper from the collapse of the Tsardom. But the Rusviet nation has known invasion and war and even revolution, and through it all, it has endured. If the Tsar no longer has the strength to bind the country together, there may be those waiting in the shadows with the will to take his place. The one constant to these lands is that they only abide the rule of the strong, and if that strength can be mobilized, then any who come to the Rusviet Tsardom with a sword, by the sword shall perish.
Thanks to King Art Games for supporting our investigation into the vast and tumultuous Rusviet Tsardom. Additionally, thank you to both the writing team over at King Art Games and Jacob Brzezalski for allowing the Templin Institute to contribute a few small details to the world of 1920+. The Tsardom is one of 3 great nations you can lead to glory in Iron Harvest, a real-time strategy game out right now. If you'd like to lead the indomitable armies of the motherland, you'll find a link to where you can buy the game in the description. And head over to twitch.tv/Templin Institute, where we are streaming the game right now.